Well, the conversation. This conversation, I want to talk about Robin DiAngelo, PhD. You see, there's a lot of things that I'm going to show you why this woman is extremely dangerous and evil, in my opinion. And I will say that. So let's look at our own blog, our own page here. A critical racial and social justice education. Now, what's that all about? Well, this is about segregation. I'll get later on into everything else. Academic. I received my PhD in multicultural education from the University of Washington in Seattle in 2004. I tenure at Westfield State University in Massachusetts. Currently, I am an affiliate professor of education at the University of Washington, Seattle. In addition, I hold 2 honorary doctoral degrees. My area of research is the whiteness studies and critical discourse analysis, tracing how whiteness is reproduced in everyday narratives. I am a 2-time winner of Students' Choice Award for Educator of the Year at the University of Washington School of Social Work. Professional. I have been a consultant, educator, and facilitator for over 20 years on issues of racial and social justice. I have worked with a wide range of organizations, including private, non-profit, and governmental. Personal. I grew up poor and white. While my class oppression has been relatively visible to me, my race privilege has not. In my efforts to uncover how race has shaped my life, I have gained deeper insight by placing the race at the center of my analysis and asking how each of my other group locations have socialized me to collude with racism. In so doing, I have been able to address in greater depth my multiple locations and how they function together to hold racism in place. I now make the distinction that I grew up poor and white, for my experiences of poverty would have been different had I not been white. Picture of her with these poor individuals that have suffered this woman's insanity. I was brought up poor white, but I don't see my colour of skin. I just see that I lived in a situation that I wasn't part of the elite group, or I didn't have the money, etc. I didn't have that chip on my shoulder as this woman does. Publications. White fragility. Why it's so hard for white people to talk about racism. Okay. I know many people have talked about it in their experience. Download the free reader's guide. Another book. What does it mean to be white? Developing a white racial literacy. Is everyone really equal? An introduction to key concepts in critical social justice education. I'm pointing out these books she's written because she's a professor. She's written these books. But the most dangerous one is this White Fragility, which is the latest one, which is the one they're utilizing now in all these corporations to basically subjugate, demonize, and denigrate anybody based on what their sexuality is, what their colour of skin is, and what bracket they fall into. In other words, putting people in boxes. There's a lot of reasons I'm going to go into what's going on, and I'm going to show you stuff that's going to be very hard, very gritty for people to fully comprehend. But I want you to stay with me on this, and I want you to go through this with me. So I'm now going to show you this character, Sergei Nilus. Now, who is Sergei Nilus? Sergei Nilus was a professor. He too wrote a book. And from that book, other people took their own interpretations and created a situation, what happened in the 40s and the 30s in Europe from this book. In 1905, Professor Sergei Nilus, an official of the Department of Foreign Religions at Moscow, published a book containing what was purported to be the protocols of the meetings of the learned elders of Zion. A copy of the original Nilus publication sits in the British Museum in London, bearing the date of its reception, August 10th, 1906. These protocols are said to be the substance of addresses delivered in Switzerland in 1897 to the innermost circle of the rulers of the international Jewry. They are said to reveal the secret plan for world domination as conceded by the Jewish nation for centuries as developed through the ages and edited by their elders of the date. The Jews, of course, have vehemently denied that such a meeting of learned elders ever took place or any kind of secret Jewish international organization or conspiracy exists. And though they claim that the protocols are forgeries, the definition of forgery is an unauthorized copy of the original. In this respect, and since the Jews didn't want their existence known to the world, they probably are forgeries, and have spent a fortune to suppress and discredit them, even making it illegal to possess them in some countries. They have attempted to address the answer to real questions the existence of such as the document raises, and have fulfilled the protocols while claiming them they did not write them. Yes. Then what is the difference whether they wrote them or not? Many scholars have noted the correspondence between the prophecies of the protocols and their fulfillment. We can see the protocols being carried out word by word in the world power of the Jews at the top have achieved. These are incredibly motivated schemers who are involved in the worldwide conspiracy to create Israel. They controlled the media to accomplish that, and they still own all of it. So this is a person's personal thing, but Sergei Nilus wrote this book about the Jewish enemy. It was based on the World Zionist meeting in Basel in 1897, and the book was called Judenstaat, and it was written by an Austrian journalist about creating a Jewish state. And its original concept of this thing was somewhere either in Uganda or around in that region. Never once was it thought about to be where it is today. This part of history I will go through another time because there's a lot to take in, and there's going to be quite a few bits and pieces of documentation will show you how this was all molded and how it created and the people behind it, like the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, etc. The usual list of characters and suspects. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to now play you something. I want you to listen to what this person is saying, and I want you to bear on board this. This is nothing about anti-Semitism. This is all about the connection between this book and the fragility, the White Fragility book. How these two professors wrote these so-called learned documents based on their own prejudice and their own biases, and then were praised at that time to be where they were. This guy was in the Department of Foreign Religions at the Moscow, and this woman, and go back to her, about me, is working in the University of Washington in Seattle, and she is now online with her publications, which now has been taken down by LinkedIn. Personal note to the lovely lady who is the person behind exposing all this, I disagree with you and agree with you. LinkedIn is a problem, but so is Coca-Cola, because Coca-Cola has done many things like this throughout its thing. This is the globalist corporation. I will get into that another day because, like I said, I don't want to distract from what I'm doing here, because I want to show why this woman is so wrong and why she is so dangerous about her books, which is about denigration, degrading people, putting people in boxes to create an elite class and a subclass. This is what is going on. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play you a video. I want you to listen to every word that this woman says.
Conservative estimate is that at least 1,400 individual children in Rotherham were victims of sexual exploitation over the 16 years. By victims, we are not talking about children who were at risk of sexual exploitation, who were friendly with victims, or who moved in the same circle. The 1,400 victims are those who had actually experienced sexual exploitation, as I have just defined it. We estimate that 1/3 of them were already known to services on account of neglect or child protection. It is hard to describe the appalling nature of the abuse the child victims suffered. They were raped by multiple perpetrators. They were trafficked to other towns and cities in the north of England. They were abducted, beaten, and intimidated. There were examples of children being doused with petrol and threatened with being set alight. They were threatened with guns, made to witness brutally violent rapes, and threatened they would be the next if they told anyone. Girls as young as 11 were raped by large numbers of male perpetrators. The detail of this information and the 15 pen pictures of exploited children, which we include in Chapter 5 of the report, were all taken from official records, files, and minutes. And we could have described many other children whose experiences were just as awful. Evidence of sexual exploitation of children in Rotherham emerged in the middle to late 1990s. A council youth service called Risky Business made the evidence known to the police and social services, not least by referring young people who needed the help which only the statutory services could provide. In most cases, especially in the early days, the evidence was disbelieved, suppressed, or ignored. In the early to mid-2000s, sexual exploitation seemed to have little priority in either service. Child victims were often blamed for what had happened to them, while no action was taken against the perpetrators. It did not seem to occur to many of those involved that any kind of sexual activity with a child is a crime, meriting investigation and prosecution. In Chapter 10, we set out the findings of 3 reports which described the nature and growing extent of sexual exploitation in Rotherham in the early 2000s. The reports were submitted to the police and social services and were ignored. In one case, the author was punished for speaking truth to power.
So why am I playing you this? Why am I telling you this story? Oh, it's because, oh, look at him. He's a white supremacist. He's Islamophobic. No. What I'm showing you and what I'm going to show you is what happens when you make one class protected through fear. Another class of people will be subjected to the worst kind of crimes humanly possible. So many of the stories of these young girls, and it's not just one city in the UK, it is in major cities throughout the United Kingdom. Oxford, Hull. I could go through a whole list of all these cities where this has been happening over years. But why was it happening over years? Why did the services turn a blind eye to it? And why did politicians turn a blind eye to it? So this is an interesting article by the BBC. It is quite alarming. I'm going to put this, I want you to listen to this first before I go any further.
I was a child, legally. If you have to be over 16 to consent, then they should keep that in place. And if you're not 16, then do something about it. There's no point having a law there and, not sticking to it. I was a child and they should have stepped in. It is damaging. There's some things that I don't remember, but, there's also things that I'll never forget for the rest of my life. And no matter what's done now, and you think if it's investigated now, it's not going to change that. It was too late. It should have been stopped and prevented.
So she was a child when she was raped. This is one of the victims. We fully acknowledge our previous failings. Chief Superintendent Harwin said the force had overhauled the way it dealt with such cases and successfully prosecuted a number of abuses. 5 men from the town were jailed for sexual offences against girls in 2010, but the report says police regarded many child victims with contempt. There was a culture. These young girls were dehumanised. If we go back to this woman, that's what she's doing with her books, dehumanizing people. So let's see what happens with dehumanizing. What else also is it? Racism fear. Here we go. The report found several staff described their nervousness about identifying the ethnic origins of the perpetrators for fear of being thought as racist. Others remember clear direction from their managers not to do so. Failures of those charged with protecting children happened despite 3 reports between 2002 and 2006, which both the council and the police were aware of, which could have been clearer in the description of the situation in Rotherham. This is just one city. These girls were specifically picked out for their colour of skin. They were selected because they were white. I'll explain what that means. They were then denigrated, subjugated and humiliated. They were beaten, raped, gang raped. In some cases with like 10 men at a time in every orifice. That'd be anal, vaginal and oral. They would be urinated on, defecated on, beaten, called white trash, white sluts. They were called everything. Why? Because that's how they were looked at. They were not looked as human. The police force ignored them because they were classed as troublesome and they didn't want to get involved because it would have classed racism. Why would I keep saying the word racism? Because the perpetrators of this grotesque, vile situation were mainly Pakistani men of Pakistani origin. It was a cultural thing. In some cases, the girls will talk about how they were walking down the street seeing these men that had raped them the night before walking with daughters the same age as them. They didn't see these girls as human. I'll go back again. Nor does this woman want you to see white people as human. This is where it starts. This is how Hitler did what he did because they dehumanized the Jews. How did they start? It started with this guy writing his book, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. A victim of abuse in Rotherham who has been called Isabel to protect her identity told BBC Panorama, "I was a child and they should have stepped in." Yes, where was the protection for these innocent victims? It doesn't matter what colour of skin they were. These were victims of a vile crime. But the reason why it is about the colour of skin is so important now is because of political correctness, because of racial identity profiling. That is how this happened. Also, the fact why politicians are the biggest joke going and are failing all of us. Here's another video. This one was with Sky News and this was in 2020.
You're taking me to, just talk me through it.
It's where sexual activities happen.
Sarah is not just haunted by the men who sexually abused her from the age of 14. They still abuse her.
So how much further?
A bit further.
She's taking me to a place on the West Yorkshire moors where she was abused as a child and more recently was taken to and assaulted as an adult after she reported the historical abuse to the police.
They raped me first and then they said to me, "Stop speaking to the police, don't speak to the police, why are you doing that?" All that kind of stuff. And then he hit me, he cut my stomach and then he hit me around the head.
He cut your stomach, what with?
Like a blade from an old pair of scissors.
Sarah, not her real name, says this lay-by is a regular spot where gangs take teenagers for sex.
You're seeing there's a pattern here. Grooming gangs continue to abuse children in northern towns and police are still failing to investigate according to alleged victims and campaigners. Whistleblower former detective at Greater Manchester Police, Maggie Oliver, has told Sky News that she has helped 2,000 victims in the last year alone. This is in 2020, people. The last year alone had been fobbed off by the authorities. To be fobbed off, to be discarded. No, we're not interested, yeah? This is quite a harrowing one. You can watch that one. Here's a BBC again. I'll play you this one.
16 years, from 1997 to 2013. It details children being raped, trafficked, beaten and sometimes doused in petrol. The inquiry says almost all the perpetrators were of Pakistani heritage. Professor Alexis Jay, a former Chief Inspector of Social Work in Scotland, said there were blatant failures by both the police and the council to stop the abuse. And she said clear evidence outlined in 3 separate reports was disbelieved, suppressed or ignored. Well, just in the last few minutes, the leader of Rotherham Council for the last decade, Roger Stone, said he is taking responsibility for what had happened and had resigned from his post. Well, the report's author, Professor Jay, gave graphic details of what she said the victims had endured.
It is hard.
So, again, politicians in power knew this was going on. But why didn't they do anything? Again, question here. Go back to this woman here. Why is nobody pulling this woman up for racism? The reason why no one's pulling this up for racism is because it's helping the political class. The political class are the problem here. The perpetrators should be done by full extent of the law. Doesn't matter what nationality you are, what colour skin. If the law of the land says that is illegal, that is illegal. You go to prison for it. You don't turn around and say you cannot touch those people because you'll be classed as racist. If you hear what happened to some of these girls in the court cases, where they had courage to stand up in court to face these men, the abuse they took from the lawyers of these men was not only shocking, but it shows the actual fact of how they saw these victims as subhuman. But here's another MP, all wind and bluster. I'll let you listen to her. This Daily Mirror is a left-wing magazine. If it plays.
I think that the government absolutely has to stop abandoning Rotherham and put some proper resources in here so that we can rebuild ourselves. But also the key thing for me is this is a national issue. This is going on all across the country. So unless the government puts a national task force in place, the disasters are just going to keep on happening and compounding. I met with Cameron yesterday.
So the typical answer of a politician, we need more resources. How about enforcing the law equally and fairly amongst everybody in the country? Why does this happen and how does this happen is the simple word of ghettos. These people live in communities where nobody talks to the police or outside people. They create themselves in these insular bubbles. If you go to London, there are many of them. I'm going to tell you a story tomorrow, a personal story, which won't involve any documentation. One of the victims is a woman called Sammy Woodhouse, who stood up and wrote a book about it. Just a Child tells the heartbreaking story of how a young girl from Rotherham was abused by her drug-dealing boyfriend, eventually giving birth to his baby, right under the nose of the very authorities who were meant to protect her. When reality dawned and Sammy realised she was one of the country's vulnerable child victims, many of whom were trafficked around the north of England, she took it upon herself to blow the whistle and save others from similar fate. Thanks to Sammy's bravery, the gang was fully exposed, as well as the authorities that did little to help her. I want you to forget about the perpetrators, they've got a prison. But what about the authorities? What about actually these people in charge who are supposed to have done their job, be held responsible and also face jail time? Maybe that's what we should do. Because the politicians have made themselves to be the protected class. That's my issue. Politicians are the protected class. Here's a picture of her, a very pretty woman, a very brave woman. Sammy Woodhouse was just 14 when she met Arshid Hussain, 10 years older. He promised to take care of her. Sammy thought she was in love, but in reality she was being groomed by a ringleader of the Britain's most notorious child sex ring. These were all victims because of their colour of skin. They were specifically targeted because of that. That is actually in the details, but the fact the British government are still covering this up shows you how damning the evidence is. I want you to really break down and listen to what I've said. I want you to take on board this, because what this woman is doing is creating the next Hitler, the next Mussolini. Her work will be that jumping ground. She is benign, she is evil, and she must be stopped at all costs. Because when you create a situation where you're making people feel subhuman and act subhuman, they will become victims of the most horrific crimes you can possibly imagine. And the ruling class, these elite idiots like herself, they don't take any consequences for what they do. Not only should her books be exposed as racist, but she should also face prosecution for creating the racist narrative. She should face a court of her peers. This woman should not be allowed anywhere near any educational services. She should not be allowed around any children. And most of all, corporate companies should not be taking her work and utilising it for her training about how to be less white. Didn't help those girls in Rotherham and places like that. And why did that happen? It happened because of people like her. Oh, but it's because they've got white privilege. They deserve to be raped. Is that it? Is that the whole point? This is why people like this Robin DiAngelo, PhD, are a problem. Academics themselves are problems. Most academics are failures in their outside work and end up being bitter and twisted with chips on their shoulder. This woman has a chip on her shoulder. She obviously hates herself for her colour of skin. I can't care less. I don't see a person for their colour of skin. I see the person by their character. If they're a good person, I deal with them. If they're not, I don't have any time for them. I have a very good friend of mine, an Indonesian guy. I don't see him as Indonesian. I see him as Sambo, and me and him have a good laugh. My Polish friends, I have a good laugh with them. My aunt is Somalian. I don't see her as Somalian. I see her as my aunt, and I love her to pieces because she was the most amazing woman you could ever meet. But this woman has to put everybody in a box. Just like the protocols of the elders of Zion put the Jewish in a box as being, oh, they want to rule the world. Perhaps there were some members within that organisation that are like that, and they were called globalists. More on that on another day. I'll save that for another conversation. But this woman needs to be fully exposed, needs to be prosecuted, a civil case against her. Somebody in America should be able to do that. For creating an inequality and race-based system that goes against the American Civil Rights Act of 1964. She is destroying that by this book and her produce of nonsense. Oh, black people in poverty. Do you realise when she says black people in poverty and all these ghetto areas, who's running these places? In America, it's the Democrats. In the UK, it's the Labour Party. Do they do anything for their community? Do they help this community? No. They take more money from it and they get these people to vote in block because they vote in block. they're block voters. Therefore, the politician keeps their power by keeping them subjugated. You want to cure the problem? You get rid of the politicians that have been sitting there for years over these people and lift these people up by giving them their chance to leave the area, their chance to expand, their chance to build their community, instead of their community being subjugated to a situation of lawlessness, drugs and violence. Because the politicians don't care. The only time you see them is every time they've got to be voted in. They come round and say, oh, look what we've done for you, and I'm promising you to do this. You don't want them because they're racist, when the real racist is the person stating it, which is why this woman is stating that everything is about race is a racist. I couldn't care less who you are or what you are. Just be yourself. You see, I live by a thing. Treat others how you want to be treated yourself. Comes from the good book. But I'll leave you on that note. It's a long one today. I apologise, but it's quite a passionate one because I'm sick of frantic, evil people like this woman. Till the next conversation. Cheers.